Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. Welcome back to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast and a very warm welcome back to the podcast. It's been, let me just think, I think it was the 1st of August that we had this gentleman on the podcast, and he's made a big return. What's today's date? It's the 9th of April. If you're listening to this in the future, it'll be the 9th of April as it is today. Mr. Richard Cogswell coming in all the way from Singapore. How are you, my friend?
Very well, Darren. Pleasure to see you again. Don't call it a comeback. I never went away.
You never went away, mate. But we had to get you back on because there's been a lot happening in the world, and there's been a bit happening in your world in the last 6 months. You've changed roles. You were an author. You're now about to be is it a second time author?
It's the second one. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So a brand new book coming out in 2025 called Mastering Networking, which is why we want to get you back on the podcast, because we want to talk about this topic because it's a very pertinent topic and one that I think everybody can get something out of, whether you're new to business or whether you've been around for a while.
Yep.
So, hey, before we jump into that, just give us a little bit of synopsis. Your background's in sales. We were just talking before we press record that we're both over 50. so that might be pertinent in terms of a topic of ageism we will talk about in this particular episode. Yeah. But just for the listeners' benefit who have not listened to the original episode, which, by the way, is episode number 699, one short of the 700. A little bit of your background, Richard, for the people's benefit.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again, Darren. So you're quite right. I've been in sales practically all of my professional career. I started in commission-only sales, so the most brutal form, and one where I learned a huge amount, and perhaps a lot about how not to go about things potentially, and it informed quite a bit of the first book, The Cultural Sales Leader, in terms of how I've learned to go about things. I found a very happy home in payments. I spent about 85% of my career in the payments industry, B2B enterprise level, and most recently as a card issuer, and in the kind of embedded accounts payable space, and broadly in cross-border payments as well. Mm-hmm. Across that piece, I have had stints in other industries. So I followed a customer, when I came to Singapore. I've been in Singapore for 13 years now. I was really following a customer of mine. Okay. So I joined a part of DHL. So I had a little stint in logistics, got headhunted by Randstad for a particular project. So I've had a little stint in that recruitment world, though not as a recruiter. And then a couple of interesting startups before finding my way back to payments with WEX, which was whatever it is, about 6 years ago now. And as you say, I've just sort of moved into another company within that cross-border payment space. So yeah, very busy on that corporate front. I'm still in the corporate world, but yes, on the side, so to speak, I've written a couple of books, and the second one hopefully is coming out this summer, in production right now. As you say, building from the sales focus to the networking side of things.
It's I love the conversation we had back in August, because it was all about sales leadership and culture and building a great culture. It's fair to say that, well, even in the last 4 weeks, there's been a lot happening in the world, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the world.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure what you're experiencing in Singapore. You're about to move into a new role, but certainly in Australia, there's a lot of uncertainty, and people are a bit concerned about, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my company? What does it mean for my role? Are we going to be okay? And we were talking just before we pressed record around this concept of networking and how sometimes people don't tap into or build a network or nurture a network until they're forced to do it.
Yes.
So I'd love, because I want to get into some conversations around all of this, but can you just let us know what was the catalyst? Was there an event or was there something that happened that said to you, it's time to write another book
Hmm.
and I need to write a book about this topic, that is mastering networking, right?
Yeah. Well, look, as usual, as with the first book, it's not one thing. It's perhaps a number of things that kind of triggered me into writing about it. And one of them, honestly, was a podcast that I got invited on whilst I was promoting the first book. And what was interesting about this podcast was it wasn't a sales focused one. You know,
Mhm.
90% of the ones I've been doing, you know, when I was out there with the cultural sales leader, have been genuinely sales focused podcasts,
Yeah.
global in nature and what have you. But this one was more of a premise of career changing. And so the topic was really, you know, how did you go from corporate to writing books, essentially?
Yeah.
And one of the questions that I was asked was, you know, what advice would you have for someone who's not confident with self promotion?
Mm.
And that got me thinking, right? And then around that time, I was also witnessing, because you know, especially here in Singapore, we still have had what some people are calling the Great Hesitation, which is to say that companies are starting to hire again now, but for a long period were cost cutting.
Hmm.
So I've seen a lot of people in my network who suddenly were finding themselves redundant and suddenly turning to, well, what do I do here? And
Mm.
going through that horrible process of LinkedIn job applications, where essentially, you know, you only have to go on LinkedIn and see some of these posts, which are some of the most interactive with posts on there, where people are sort of saying the same story. You know, I've done 100 applications. I've got, you know, maybe 70% automatic rejections. I've got 2 interviews, you know, and I've been ghosted. You know,
Yeah.
that's the usual sort of experience. And, you know, I was kind of reflecting as also on my past career. You know, we were talking earlier, I've been made redundant myself 5 times in my career, but I've also created the jobs that I eventually got into that were posted
Hmm.
publicly myself 5 times as well. And I've
Yeah.
done that through networking. Now, anecdotally, as I say, this isn't a real statistic, but in talking to other recruiters and you know, also having that experience of my own, only about 20% of you know, publicized roles on LinkedIn are genuinely open, which is to
Hmm.
say without an internal candidate or an external candidate who's already been identified
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form. And of course, that person has more access to the hiring panel, can have a better sense of what the challenges are and what their value is, and can articulate that in a much better way than someone coming in from outside. Someone
Yeah.
coming in from outside has to be truly exceptional to upset that. And so it got me to thinking, you know, networking is a skill that I think everybody needs to have in professional life. It's not just about those times of crisis, you know, when you do need to find whatever it is, a new gig or whatever. It is about, you know, being recognized for what you do, being
Mm.
valued for what you do. And it's also about building customer bases and retaining and finding new customers. So it's a whole topic unto itself. But I really wrote this book from the perspective of mastering networking so that you might create the job opportunities that you deserve.
Mm.
And that's not just when you absolutely need to in times of crisis, but it's also, you know, looking back through my career, you know, as I'm sure with most people, when did you get your biggest rises or biggest promotions? It's generally from leaving one company to go to another, right? And in large part, again, networking gets you to your goals faster than if you
Mm.
were to try and just sit there online getting rejected constantly left, right and center, right? um, so it's really about all of that, and it's also to, you know, in the context of hiring, it's to try to help people understand why the recruitment industry has changed so fundamentally. Why is it that the candidate experience is so horrible? There are
Mm.
dynamics behind all of this, and a lot of people don't understand how that industry sources and finds candidates. So you also have to be prepared to know that you've got to have certain keywords in place and just do some basics,
Yeah.
which again, I don't think a lot of people think about, because they think recruitment is a people industry. It is, but the one-to-one relationship with the recruiter that we used to have maybe 10 years ago doesn't exist anymore, right?
Yeah.
So it's for all of those reasons. But as you say, it's a wider topic, and it's probably one that I can spin off into other areas around just, how do you look at networking from a professional standpoint,
Mm.
not just from a hiring one.
It's a great point you make, and I'm just reflecting as you were talking, Rich, going back to when I was early in my sales leadership career, and I was doing some mentoring of some up and coming salespeople who were not directly in my team, but they were thinking about how do I take the next step. And I remember talking to them about uh, thinking about what does the next step look like for them, putting themselves in the shoes of a person who is currently doing the role that they would like to aspire to,
Right.
and seeking to build a relationship with those people, not for any personal gain in terms of can you give me a job, but to get an understanding about what goes on in the minds of those people when they're doing that particular job, to the point where they get an understanding of that, right? Which is in a form networking. Because I said to them,
No, definitely.
yeah, and my whole philosophy was, and I did this myself, that it wasn't a job because I've never had a job. I'm probably similar to you. I've never had a job that I actually applied for that I got. All my
Mm,
jobs were through people that I knew, or I got tapped in the shoulder because of I guess, the perceived value that I added, and
mm,
people thought maybe I could add value in another area. So
yeah.
my whole philosophy was getting ready for the next role when you're not doing that role, so that when people look at that, and this is about giving, then people think, well, you're already doing this type of role, so you're probably a likely candidate, so let's have a conversation. So then it became just an evolutionary step rather than, oh, I've got to go and apply for that role. So
100%. Yeah.
from a networking point of view, it's probably the same.
I resonate with that so much. I think back again to my career, as I say, I started off in commission only sales, but then, came into the world of enterprise sales. And that's obviously an evolution just in sales, full stop, right? And again, you're not necessarily getting any training, right?
Mm,
So where do you learn from? And my attitude was always to try and identify who I thought across an organization, cross-functionally, was expert
mm,
in what they did. And I would seek out these people. And it was always informative, of course, those who, especially salespeople, wouldn't want to share their IP, so to speak. But learning from those guys and then making what you learned your own was part of certainly part of my career journey.
mm,
And that, as you say, is networking, right?
mhm.
And when you sort of throw that forward into the world of, LinkedIn, and, when you're in these sort of events, environments, and what have you, what I think that's really morphing towards is the creation of what people say today is your personal brand, right?
Mm,
Which is about being recognized for the values, processes, potential impact that you could have, which is why you're getting tapped on the shoulder.
yeah.
And you're only being tapped on the shoulder because people know what you know, right? But you have to invest in that, and you can't. It's not going to be there if you don't put some effort in.
Mm,
Ultimately, is the whole premise to this. So I think the majority of us are entering industries or careers where we anticipate a long-term journey where we'll become expert over time. And I think the days of, if they ever existed, actually, of just focusing on your career without thinking about the wider world outside of that, I, I mean, it's probably not true to say that you could ever just do that. There's always been an element of networking in across any sort of career or group, but I
mm,
think it's more important than ever. And
yeah.
just for all the reasons we touched on, but more than that, as I say, how do you source and find your customers? Customer referrals, such an
Mm,
important thing, and for that to happen, people need to understand what you represent, what value you can bring. So that also is networking as well.
mm. Oh, it is, and we talk about in sales all the time that it's the ultimate form of service, but people do business with those people who they know, they like, and they trust, and who
Right.
they remember. And I mean, back in the day when I was carrying the bag in sales, LinkedIn didn't exist. So you'd go into a CIO of an organization and ask them the killer question, tell me all about your business, followed quickly by what keeps you up at night, which
Yeah.
was just the gold. Now you've got to do research because there's so much information available to you. So you can't do that. And it staggers me the number of people, even in business today, if you use a networking platform such as LinkedIn, I know there's others out there, but most people, the vast majority tend to use LinkedIn. It
Yeah.
staggers me the number of people, Rich, and I'd be interested in your take on this, who refuse to have a profile, refuse to do anything on the profile.
Mm.
And it's almost like they want to be under the radar, right? Because they say, well, the key people who know me, they know me, and that's all I need.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Forgetting the fact that, you know what, it's a way to put yourself out there, not
Yes.
to necessarily self-promote, but to let people know what you value, to know what you stand for, because
Yeah.
people are always watching, particularly from a leadership point of view. They're always watching.
Yeah. Again, I think this touches on a number of topics, right? Yeah. You say it's not necessarily about self promotion, and I wonder how much of that is people's reticence that they have a problem with the idea of self promotion or sales, right? And
Yeah.
they see it as insincere, or I talk about this again in the book. I think going back to that question, what advice would you give people who are not comfortable with self promotion, is to analyze that a little bit. And I think, you know, we've all been sold to by people who, I think of, every time I've walked into a tech shop, with the intention of just browsing TVs, and then you're sort of jumped on by people who are not interested in you so much. They're not interested in your motivations as to why you might be there, but it's all
Mm.
about the sale, right? And we've all had dreadful cold calls and experiences like that where it's just one-sided. But that is not sales. And
No.
this is the value that you preach. This is what we know in various facets of the sales industry. To my mind, sales is about helping. you know it's about finding solutions. It's about being ethical, to be honest enough to say, is there a sale to be made here or not? It's about advice.
Mm.
And I just think about, in all facets, there are so many examples of people who turn to people who have become trusted advisors because these people have not sold day one, but
Mm.
have provided advice, have been there, have been in contact, have been visible. And then in those times of need, people have turned to them, whether it's insurance or cars or
Yeah.
what have you. And so I think the first thing is that a certain category needs to become more comfortable with the concept of what sales really is,
Mm.
and self-promotion to that
Yeah.
extent. Um, and then the flip side to that as well. And again, I just think, I think of my time as being in the hiring seat where I'm hiring people. And you talk also about LinkedIn being about research, which to my mind, that's also at the entry point to networking as well.
Mm.
It's fundamentally about not only being polite enough to spend some time to understand who I'm about to talk to, or who I might meet,
Mm.
or what this group might be interested in, by doing some basic and extended research. It's about then being able to articulate what value I could bring to what I perceive your challenges might be. And how many candidates do that?
Yeah.
Frankly, I don't even know if it's 1%, right? And how many times have you been sat in a hiring situation where you've had a wonderful CV, and then somebody else turns up and
Mm.
you're like, wait, I want to meet this person. Who are you? Right?
Mm.
And they've done no research other than maybe a browse of the website, which might be misinterpreted, right? If you've got
Yeah.
divisions and what have you. And they've had no sense of you, perhaps what your style is. And so in the context of putting a profile out there, I think it's also about allowing yourself to be visible, but others to come with some value to you,
Yeah.
right? And I think you've got to position it in such a way that people are more comfortable with that whole concept.
Mm.
But again, when you look at the whole hiring landscape, I think it's an easier sell in a way because if you're talking to people who are literally making hundreds of applications for about 2% return, it's in your face. You've got
Yeah.
to change the game if you
Yeah.
want to get better results,
Yeah.
right? Um, but it takes sometimes a formative moment like that for people to think differently, and I suppose that's what I'm trying to turn around a little bit.
Well, it's almost like being prepared before the opportunity arises, which is something that John Wooden, the famous basketball coach at UCLA, used to always talk to his players about.
Mm,
That when there's an opportunity to shoot the basket, you better have been prepared and done the practice for when that moment presents itself. Because the thing is, you don't know when that moment's going to present itself. And if we take things like the global financial crisis or the dot-com boom or 2012 or whatever the case might be. And I know talking to some companies back end of 24 and 25 hasn't been great.
mm,
If you're not prepared, if you're not doing some work on yourself, and this is not so much as we've just talked about beating your own trumpet, but it's about being really clear to the marketplace about who you are and what you stand for and what value you're looking to provide the marketplace, then
mm.
people are not going to know you, right? So you might be the greatest, the biggest secret that the world's ever seen, and if nobody knows you, then nobody's going to know you, right?
But
And
but also, Darren, it's let's go back to this whole issue about hiring and being a candidate. What most people don't realize is that for a number of dynamics, the recruiter is no longer looking to sell individuals, right? It used to be back in the day, and now that's not. There are still confidential hire and
yeah,
headhunters who will take the time to get to understand you, your values, and will then sell those
mm,
into their client. Absolutely, that's true. But 90% of recruiters out there have become more transactional. And it's not the recruiter themselves who are looking for candidates, it's sourcing centers. And
mm,
it's sourcing centers who are using algorithms that are looking for keywords. And if you don't have a profile with keywords on, you're never going to be found,
mm,
right? So, what these people are willfully doing is also blocking opportunity for
yeah,
themselves,
yeah,
right? Um, and so that's a vital facet. So again, whatever your role is, right? And you and I think in terms of sales focus, obviously, and in that world, we're perhaps more naturally bent towards extending ourselves and putting ourselves out. We're used to rejection. We're used to, you know, uh, being vulnerable and putting ourselves out there to find new opportunity and new customers. But I think if you're not in a sales role, you still have to think about what is your journey?
mm,
How are you going to be found? How are you going to be able to show the world what it is that you do and what value that you bring, and perhaps
yeah,
what your philosophies are to enable you to get to other opportunities.
yeah, yeah. Um, and it's a constant thing. And for some, this often comes down to a personality trait as well, because people who are naturally introverted, who don't want to blow their own trumpet, or it's a completely opposite thing to what they're normally doing, it's really
Yeah,
difficult for them, right? So, but and the people that I sort of sometimes mentor is it's just a fact of life. You're gonna have to get over it, but you need somebody who can support you through that process
yeah,
because it's one of those uncomfortable realities that if people
yeah,
don't know you, then there's going to be less opportunity. And the problem with that is the people who do put themselves out there,
yeah,
irrespective of how they feel, they're the ones that potentially, at least on the surface, appear to get the opportunities. And you might sit back and say, how come that person got that opportunity? I am so much better than that person. I got more experience. And I said, yeah, but you haven't told anybody about it. You might be the
Correct,
world's biggest
correct,
kept
correct.
secret.
I'm smiling so much because I love that you've brought this up. How many of the best salespeople that you've ever met have identified themselves as introverted at one stage or another, or indeed still?
Lots.
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 And some of the best that I've ever come across in the business, right? Honestly, you know, what I'm trying to say here is that if you're not confident in a group environment, for example,
Mm.
you identify the person who is, and you went over there and you said, "How are you so good at this? I'm absolutely useless." They'll probably tell you they have all the same fears, insecurities as you do, right? And I'm here to tell you, as you know, they'll never go away. You're always
No.
going to be nervous. You're always going to be fearful. You might always feel someone's out of your league or whatever. But I also think about this in the context of, and I say this in the book, dating, right? If
Yeah.
you're prepared to put yourself at risk for the greatest prize, which is love, why wouldn't
Mm.
you do that for your career, right?
Totally.
And what is in common to these two things? It's about being authentic, showing that
Yes.
you're a good partner, right? Being human. Yeah.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many amazing conversations I've had with people, and precisely because I didn't sort of go to the default, you know, who are you? How, where do you come from? What do you do?
Yeah.
We've had amazing conversations. And then I found out that they've been the global CEO or the chief legal person for global position or whatever. And if I knew that up front, I probably would not have been so effective in those conversations, right? So a lot of this also is about learning to be authentic
Mm.
and to be prepared. You've got to have your 10-second elevator pitch about
Yeah.
who you are, what you do, how do you do what you do, right? I think you've got to have that. That also should give you some confidence. But you should also learn to be curious about others and be yourself,
Mm.
authentic, and develop a little bit of EQ, obviously, about not outstaying your welcome and being succinct and clear in any asks or conversations that you're having with people. But these are all traits you can learn,
Mm.
right? And ultimately, you can go from a position of total fear to one where you actually enjoy this because your curiosity in meeting incredible and interesting people brings you not just the benefits of your network and
Mm.
benefits of your visibility within that, but it's fun, right?
Yeah.
So I think people have to understand that this is a journey, and it's a bit like developing a muscle in the gym. You got to work at it, and
Yeah.
these insecurities, fears will never go away. But as you say, you've got to turn that light on for people to also match it to their goals and where they would like to be, and so that they see that this is part of that journey to get them to
Yeah.
where they want to be as well.
It's interesting you say that because often, because my very first Myers-Briggs profile I did, I
Mm,
share this in my workshops all the time, that my first Myers-Briggs profile was 1995. I was thinking about going into sales because I saw the sales guys driving nice cars, wearing nice suits, playing lots of golf, having long lunches. This is before the fringe benefits tax stranglehold, so you could stay out and have 13-hour lunches, which was really cool. But my Myers-Briggs profile was INTJ, right? So for those who know that, it's very introverted with a focus on detail. And so I remember the person unpacking the profile for me and said, and I quote, Darren, you'll never be successful in sales because look at your profile. You're introverted and you got such a focus on detail. Because my background was engineering, right? I
right,
wasn't
right.
far out of engineering. So luckily I didn't listen to her because I would not be sitting here today having this conversation with you.
Right.
But I often get asked in workshops that people who have to speak for a living, they have to do pitches, they have to present, and they say I can't do that. I can't do what you do because I'm introverted. And I say, well, what do you think I am?
Mm,
And they say, well, you're extrovert. Look at you. You can just stand up in front of a group all day and just talk. And
yeah.
yeah, but it's practice. It's learned practice. Now,
And
do I like doing it? Yes, I love doing it.
mm,
But I'm the type of person you described it. I'm the type of person that goes to a networking event And I'm not the one that's going to go up to everybody and say, "G'day." I'm the likely to be the one that is watching in the corner, looking
Mm.
for somebody who maybe there might be a bit of a connection, and then I might approach them. Or better still, I'll wait for others to approach me, right?
Correct.
So this is a learned skill, and you have to put yourself out there. So part of it is, I guess what I'm saying is to develop a level of courage to get a little bit out of your comfort zone, which is the vulnerability and the authenticity piece.
Yeah.
Because even when you're doing that, you risk you risks the possibility of being rejected, right? And I say this
Yeah.
to people.
Correct.
Imagine going up to somebody and just think about this. Has it ever happened? And all the times I've asked this, nobody has said yes, this has happened. Have you gone up to somebody and said, "Hello, my name is," insert your name there, and extended your hand for a handshake and been ignored?
Mm. But you know what? Again, our minds, and this is evolutionary development, right? Our
Yeah.
minds are fabulous at creating the worst scenario, right? But to your point, it never practically manifests that way. And so part of putting yourself out there, you're right, is to give you that practical example that yes, it's all okay. And
Mm,
and also I think, do you know what? A fundamental trait that I think people who are uncomfortable in this space don't have is to take a moment to celebrate their successes, right?
yeah.
So I think you've got to also reflect. And you know, I also say start with small stakes. So for
Mm,
example, you know, go and have coffee with a colleague you don't know very well. Start there, right?
mm,
Have very incremental goals. Like what are you trying to achieve? I want to get a connection.
mm.
That's not a huge goal.
No.
Or I want to get to a next conversation, right? You know, a large part of networking to create a career opportunity is to make a connection with one person who's going to introduce you to somebody else. And my only goal in that is to get to that someone else.
Yep.
It's not to get the job, it's to get to that next conversation. So it's a
Mm,
small incremental step. But then within that, take a moment to reflect and ask yourself what went well,
yeah.
be honest and ask what went badly and what could I improve. But then accept that you have done a very courageous thing. You've stepped beyond your, you know, your comfort zone. And to your point, who rejected you,
Mm,
right? Who was rude to you, right? Who didn't have a conversation with you? That's what gives you confidence to go forward and become better
yeah.
for the next time.
Yep.
But again, I think a large part of this again is to switch on that mindset of, and people call it a growth mindset or a learning mindset or what have you. But what I think that's really about is being curious
Yeah.
and asking more questions than you are talking about yourself. Now, for those of us who are introvert, that's actually a comfortable space because we're not having to talk about ourselves so much, right?
Totally.
Right. But you know, I think you know that again, preparation to a certain extent is going to help you be more confident when
Mm,
you're in those kind of dialogues with people. But also, you know, just that over time, when you realize you're not going to be rejected, you're not going to, you know, be humiliated or whatever it might be, you'll start to already relax and
mm.
have some fun with it. And I think that's got to be the evolutionary journey people go on as well, right?
There's a couple of points there I wanted to bring up. The first one, as you were talking about the art of questioning, I was actually listening to a podcast this morning, and on that podcast was the comedian Will Anderson, who is a well-known stand-up comedian from Australia.
Yeah.
And he was recounting how his inspiration to become a stand-up comedian was Billy Connolly. And his mum took him to see
Yeah.
Billy Connolly when he was like 17 years of age, and it was in the Hamer Hall here in Melbourne. And that was the day that he thought, man, I want to do what he does, right? Now, he had no concept of the amount of work it would take to even get close to that.
Yeah.
But a number of years later, he was as a radio announcer, and he got the opportunity to interview as part of his radio gig Billy Connolly, who was promoting a movie. Anyway, they interviewed, and it was about to have lunch, and his colleague went up to Billy and said, "Hey, just so you know, Will is a huge fan of yours, and you are the inspiration to him being a comedian today." Right? So Billy said, I'm about to go to this lunch. They're promoting this movie, blah, blah, blah. Come to lunch with me. So Will Anderson sat at the table with Billy Connolly next to him. And then after the lunch, he was telling people about the experience, and they were asking him, so what sort of questions did you ask him? What did you find out about Billy? And he said, I couldn't find out anything about Billy because Billy spent the whole time asking me questions about what it was like to be a comedian, what it was like to go through all the process. And it was such a great example of this world famous individual who
Yeah.
wasn't making about himself, but was interested in the other person to the point where he didn't get a word in edgeways and he couldn't even ask Billy a question.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, and I'd love to pick up on that again in the context of this journey of networking to create your own job opportunities. A large part of that is to actually become a little bit of a salesperson because
Mm,
let's again, this is a sales podcast and we're both sales people, but a large part of what's going on there is that what Billy's doing and what you can be doing throughout networking is understanding what is going on in an environment, right?
yeah,
What is going on with an individual or an environment such that you are then able to position your capabilities and your values and your processes and outcomes that you've delivered in other environments in a strong way within that conversation. Now,
yeah,
I know I'm taking it a little beyond that environment, but that's the opportunity presented to you. And how many other people are going to be able to approach any opportunity in that way? Which is again becoming confident with what sales is, because that's ultimately what sales is as well, right?
it is.
What Billy's done there is he's actually being very generous, obviously, with his time and being very curious, but he's learning an awful lot of good stuff about that other individual across the table, right?
Yeah,
Um, and again, I talk about taking control of interview processes. I can't tell you how many times I've been in very nice conversations, but they've been drifting. But the
hmm
moment you put a one pager in front of them, which is like, this is where I'm going to focus for what results, job offer comes the next, like within hours, right?
yes, yeah,
So again, taking your illustration there and just pulling it on into that environment. I think again, this is where the power of all of these networking techniques come into play, and allow people to position themselves better.
nice. As you were talking, the other part I was going to share with you, and I'd love to ask you this question. It fits in beautifully with what you've just said. Is I love your thoughts on the concept of disassociating from the outcome. So disassociating from any pressure to
Mm,
have to get the perfect connection or have to get the interview.
mm,
Because I see a lot of people, particularly in a position where perhaps they've been made redundant or they're not happy with their role and they're looking for something else.
yeah,
They put so much pressure on themselves. I have to get this. I've only got one interview over the next 2 weeks. I've got to get one of them, right? And there's just so much
yeah,
pressure to get the outcome.
yeah,
I keep saying, I say this to salespeople all the time. If you can get better at disassociating from the outcome will probably take care of itself. But
yeah,
enjoy the process and be genuine, but be of value in the process. And
yeah.
more often than not, you'll get the outcome. What's your thoughts on that? What's your experience around that?
Yeah, I totally agree. This is why I think about those incremental goals, right? Um, see again. Let's look at that redundancy thing, and let's look at someone who's making 100 applications and maybe getting 2 invites to interview. Those interviews become super pressured,
Mm,
super important, right? Um, and the danger in all of that is that you're not ready for that environment. And the danger is, as you say, you put out some signals that are, not going to help you
yeah.
in the sense that you may come across as, I mean, it's just too pressured.
Yeah.
Um, so I think again, what this has got to be about is ensuring that you're practiced about being able to talk about yourself, but then also fundamentally that you've done enough research to enable you to be having a two-way conversation, which already takes some of that pressure off.
Yeah.
And as I say, what should your goal be? You know, no one's having one interview to get to a job anymore, right? There's always a panel. And if you're lucky, the panel's three people.
Yeah.
How many companies are doing 10 or God knows how many? It's ridiculous, right? But again, this you've got to just think in terms of I need to get to the next conversation.
Mm.
But also I would say, you know, a great goal is I need to learn more about what is happening in that environment. What is the leadership style of the person I'm ultimately going to be talking to or reporting to? What
Yeah.
are the challenges? What is happening in that industry? You know, why is this role there? You know, you've got to learn some of this stuff so that you're able then to do some other work around the edges, maybe talk to other people who are in that
Mm.
environment, so that you're already differentiating yourself in the next conversation
Yeah.
that you have, right? Um, and if you're putting yourself through a networking process, you're going to have more conversations before the most important one,
Mm.
right? So you should already be more relaxed.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I try to say in all of this, which is about depressuring, is that, you know, this research piece, I think a lot of people don't do research because they're afraid of not being correct, right?
Mm.
You don't have to be. And equally, you know, you don't have to have a flawless interaction with somebody else in a social or a networking environment. You just don't. If you're at least 70% correct about the environment that you've researched or what you think the challenges might be,
Yeah.
I will guarantee that the person on the other side of the table will be so thankful that this is an interesting conversation now
Mm.
that they will already help you, already coach you, already make you better for the next conversation, right?
Yeah.
And and again, that's going to take so much pressure off you because you already are having a better two-way conversation than a one-way interview where you're feeling all the pressure and you're afraid of not getting to the next step, right?
And when that happens, often what we try to do is, and I've seen it, I've seen people do it in interviews. They try to work so hard that they want to get the right thing out, and they're almost trying to convince you that they are worthy of an investment in.
Well,
And
there's two sides to that. I think people need to develop their stories.
oh yeah, of course.
And I think a large part of that preparation is to look at your career journey and but not look at it just purely in terms of I got this job, I did that. It's what problems or challenges did you face and what did you
Mm.
do about those and what was your process and what were
Yeah.
your outcomes, even if they're failures, right? You can if you're telling that story and it didn't work out but you learned and you've adapted, that's an incredible story. so
Totally.
so I think yeah, to your point, that again you've got to pick your moments and sort of weave those into the environment that you're in and that
Yeah.
you've researched around, as opposed to just sort of, you know, boasting or what have you, right? But you do need to think about that and think about what are the stories and not just save those for interview. You know, you got to put that in your CV to a certain extent, short form, obviously,
Mm.
bullet point. But you should also bullet point that on your LinkedIn as well. And so many people don't do that. I mean, this is the problem as well. You know, if you put yourself in the hiring person's shoes, right, and you just see a list of I did this, I did that, I did the other, you know, so what in many ways, right?
Exactly.
From the right industry, but I know
Totally.
nothing about you.
That's right. But here's my beautiful polished CV, which has been done by either AI or some professional resume writing organization. But it's not necessarily me because you want to have that conversation because what's on paper, and I see this all the time, right? I've had people I've worked with in corporate that I look at their LinkedIn profile and I know the role they did, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes they might embellish the title or whatever the case might be. And I have a look at what they did and I'm thinking, that's interesting. They didn't do that. They were in the room, but it wasn't them doing that.
Right.
So
Right.
it has to be genuine, it has to be authentic, but then you need to be able to wrap a story around it as well
Yeah.
that you can articulate that because it's becoming who you are.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And again, just to go back to that, people who are not confident in this space, none of that is to be insincere. None of that is to be boastful,
Mm.
right?
No.
Um, and again, why would you not consider an interview as an opportunity to have a deeper two-way conversation, right? What yeah, it's that's the opportunity that's there for you.
Totally.
And if you come at it from that point of view, I would almost guarantee you're probably not putting yourself under so much pressure already.
Yes. And it's really funny, Rich. I'd be interested in your take on this. When we don't put so much pressure on ourselves to have to convince and get things right,
Mm.
the messaging starts to flow. There's this different energy transfer to the other person, and more
Yeah,
often than not, because you're being genuine, the results just seem to take care of themselves. And you might walk away from that conversation and think, "Oh my God, that was horrendous. I didn't say the right thing. I forgot my punchline."
right, right.
I was driving home from the interview and I forgot to tell them that. But the people who were interviewing you or having the conversation are thinking, man, that was one of the most insightful conversations I've had for a while. And
Yeah,
here we are putting pressure on ourselves. I didn't cover that point. I didn't cover this point. What we're saying is just be you, right? Just
just
be
be,
you and be a human being because people crave human connections because there's so many bots out there that people are talking to. We just have a we want to deal with a human being.
yeah, 100%. And then I would always say again, reflect and look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and where you would want to go. But then also consider what could you do before the next conversation, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's not just about messaging everyone, say thanks, that was a great conversation. Maybe we could touch on XYZ next time. It's about, can I speak to someone in that organization who's going to give me more input or more of a visualization about whatever we talked about in that first conversation.
Yeah.
And then reaching out to that person again, 2 3 bullet points. I'm in a process, I'm really interested about this is what I'd love to pick your brains on if you've got 5 minutes or time for a coffee or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you bring that information into the next one,
Hmm.
or you create that one pager that says, do you know what, I've been thinking about this deeply, and this is where I think I can add value, right?
Yeah.
And use that to become the basis for the next conversation, because then you're already taking control of it.
Hmm.
You're not passive anymore,
No.
right? And to your point, if the panel is already excited about you because of your imperfect first conversation, how excited they're going to be when they see that someone's taking the initiative, is passionate about it, is interested, and has done some extra work. I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to elevate yourself beyond anyone. And again, I just emphasize, don't have to be 100% correct, especially if you're
No.
coming from outside of an organization looking in. How could you be?
Totally.
If you're just on the money enough, people are going to help you already. So
They will. They will.
think about that.
So as we sort of bring this to a close, it'd be remiss of me not to talk about the fact that as we said, I think we said this at the beginning of the podcast, or maybe before we press record, both of us are over 50, right? So
Yeah,
there's a lot of people
yeah,
out there in the workforce that perhaps have been with organizations for a while and now suddenly find themselves, access to requirements, etc.
yeah.
In this particular book and some of the work and some of the conversations you're having, what are some of the things that are the challenges for people of a certain age, but also what are some of the opportunities for people who perhaps are in their 50s who still want to work, and even some people in their 60s, right, still wanting to work, and who says you can't work until you're 70 plus?
100%.
Things people need to be sort of conscious of or, focused on.
it's amazing. This is again about networking. In creating the new book, I got on another sort of corporate stroke sales podcast called The Corporate Couch. And we were talking offline about, what I'm writing in terms of, networking to create jobs. And this guy introduced me to a chap called Paul Hatch, who's ex-US Navy, left the Navy after a storied career and moved into finance, and is now very passionate about this topic of ageism. And he's created an environment to help, and this is based in the US now, but he's looking to take it global, but basically to help people age 50 and above who frankly are being somewhat ignored. And worse than that, there's even an element of prejudice in the thinking of hiring companies around people in that demographic. And I think this is an incredibly important topic because, to your point, we're living healthier, longer lives for a start. And to your point, retirement doesn't happen at a fixed age anymore.
Yeah.
And as individuals, we all want to stay active, remain relevant. We've got experiences and knowledge that, we might want to pass on. And we might not be ready to leave the workforce for all of those reasons. That's one thing. But then there's also a more frightening demographic. If you look at, there's lots of stuff on the internet about how ready people are for longer retirements and can they afford it or not. And there's an economic aspect to this as well.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry to say that, this demographic in the workforce is being very ill-served at the moment. And my sense of this is that, if you've had a career and you've had large, big titles, you've been VP or CEO or whatever, and you send an application in, the chances are you're likely to get a very sort of lazy, you're overqualified response, right? And what is not happening there is a conversation between the hiring company and the individual about what their motivations are, because there could be great motivations for going for a smaller or a sideways job,
Yep.
which are about, work-life balance, giving back, right? Wanting to learn something new. These are, but the perception is that this person will be too expensive, won't stay in the role, will go to something better paying, right? Won't adapt to technology, won't fit the culture. These are the perceptions, but the realities are that all statistics say the opposite.
Yeah.
Which is to say that people 50 and above will stay longer in a role than those 30 to 40, right? The average tenure is what, 2 to 3 years, whereas, 50 and above will stay 4 to 5 longer even. There's huge value in the knowledge that these people retain. So there's coaching and mentoring opportunities. And there's just so much value potentially being left on the table. So I would encourage you to look up Paul Hatch and what he's doing. It's really interesting. But I think, this is something that is only going to become more pronounced and, is a global thing, right? It's every country, environment, culture is going to go through this challenge, I think, right? But it's also about how people, for want of a better word, sell themselves as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm deeply, on the one hand, frustrated by that, but also on the other hand, passionate about it, because I think there's a lot of education that needs to go through the system, and by that I mean hiring companies and their attitude towards this, and there is some good things happening, like returnism as a concept. Which I think is quite new, and not all companies embrace this, but it's the idea of inviting back people who have worked at that company, plugging them in so that they're part of the day-to-day emails, meetings, but also giving them an emphasis around coaching, support, mentorship. right? Which I think is an incredibly cool idea. But that's, you know, that's one way to answer this. But I think, you know, a combination of helping companies and recruiters realize the potential of these people and to have conversations again with these candidates is one thing, but also helping these candidates in how they go about reaching out to these companies. Because unfortunately, again, the LinkedIn process of applying, that's just going to end up with these rejections, unfortunately.
It is, which means that we have to revert back to using maybe our personal networks on LinkedIn and thinking
Yeah,
about who do I know within this organization, or who do I know who might know somebody within this organization that I could have a conversation with.
correct.
I'm
Yeah,
interested in applying for this role. I just want to learn a little bit about that. So,
yeah,
because
correct.
I wonder how much with this ageism stuff is self-imposed, where people think, "Oh man, I've been at this organization for so long, I'll never get another role." And I remember a guy used to work at Optus and Telstra with me years and years ago. And I was actually with Optus, and he'd been at Optus for like 25 years since pretty much it started. And
Mm,
he got made redundant, and he spent about 2 or 3 years looking for roles, but he was literally pigeonholing himself into a specific niche and
right.
couldn't look out of that. Once he looked out of that, all of a sudden all these opportunities came left, right, and center.
Right.
So I wonder how much of this is self-imposed to say nobody's going to hire somebody that's 55, nobody's going to hire somebody that's 62, right? Etc. So maybe we need to get over that.
I think, yeah, I'm sure there is a lot of that as well, right? And that just makes me think about, you know, someone like yourself who has gone out for themselves and created something as well. You know, how many people don't do that because, again, of fear, or, you know, they don't know where to start, or whatever it might be. So again, a large part of what Paul Hatch is doing is that work to, you know, be an identified place where people can go and have that type of conversation and
Mhm.
get that type of support, I suppose.
Yeah.
And, you know, to have that kind of conversation of, you know, well, have you thought about this, or how have you been going about your applications, you know,
Mhm.
because, you know, some very basic things like perhaps you don't, you know, perhaps you change the language on your CV, for example, right? That you, not to diminish your seniority, but you use a slightly different language, right?
Yeah.
So you're immediately not, I suppose, putting yourself out there as an incredibly senior looking candidate to a
Yeah.
recruiter who either might be like, whoa, I'm too scared to talk to that person, or you're too big for this role, and just lazily reject them, you know?
Potentially. Potentially. Man, lots to think about. It's been a fabulous conversation as always. So, Rich, for people listening to this and they want to learn more about you, connect with you, but also get hold of the book when it comes out later
Yeah.
this year, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Darren. Well, the first thing is LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Please find me on LinkedIn, Richard Cogswell. Um, the book, now, the title may change slightly. I'm just going through this process right now, but at the moment, it's Mastering Networking, Forging Your Own Career Opportunities.
Hmm.
Um, it may change, but that's likely to be what it is. It's literally going into production now, so, you know, copy editing and all of that. So it's probably going to be summertime, sort of June-ish,
Yeah.
and it will be out on everywhere, you know, Amazon, Apple, Google, all the usual.
Nice.
So I'll certainly be talking about that on all the channels that I have. I also have a website, richardcogswell.com.
Yeah.
I will be improving that as well, but that's also somewhere where people can find me. But LinkedIn, I would say, let's have a conversation there. That's the best.
Perfect. I'll no doubt you'll provide updates as the production ramps up and ready to be launched as well. So I encourage people to connect with you certainly. You're a good fellow. So mate, it's great speaking to you again, and thanks for
And
being a
you,
guest on the podcast, my friend.
thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you, Darren. Cheers. All the best.
Anyway, all the best. Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it. But also, if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.